Okay, hi everybody, thank you for coming, and we have a lot of dedications today. Tonight's shir is dedicated a Refuah Shlema for Baruch ben Frida, and for the lasting unity of the people of Israel, for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, and of course the safety of the Chayalim, as well as the Chatufim, and an Aliyat Neshamot for Yitzchak ben Hirsh. And then we don't have his full name, but Rabbi Tzvi Kogen, Hashem Yikom Dama, who was the Chabad Shaliach, who was murdered, for Itka bat Yosef. And tonight's class and the next four classes are also dedicated. Lizecher nishmas, Rabbi and Mrs. Philip Finkelstein, by Ephraim and Naomi Finkelstein. As I've said, Rabbi and Mrs. Finkelstein were tremendous influences on my life and the lives of many, many others, and I'm very happy to give a shir lizecher nishmatam. Finally, exciting news. YIBONEH is in the middle of renovations for their new center of operations right above the Bagel Cafe on Emek. Next to the Bagel Cafe on Emek Refuah, preparing this fantastic property to be ready for the community. The YIBONEH Center will be accessible to be used as a hub for chesed projects helping the community. There'll be a Beis Medrash, there'll be a shul, there'll be classrooms, a working kiddush for life cycle events, and a weekly Shabbat kiddush, which, as a Rav of a shul, I can tell you how vitally important that is. Target dates for the grand opening is being planned for Hanukkah 5785, just a few weeks. Details will be shared in the coming weeks. All of us have an opportunity at the very beginning to partner with the establishment of this Beis Medrash and Center. A special dedication list is being prepared for the name on the Beis HaMidrash, for the Aron HaKodesh, the English library, various other items. If you want in now, before the list is publicized, now is the time before somebody else comes in and takes away that particular opportunity. Please consider a donation now or at the end of the year, financial year contribution. And a link is found below in the YouTube description box and on the website. For special dedications, you may contact Rabbi Poston directly, and his email is found below and on the website. Again, it's a true, valuable contribution to the community. All of you know, YIBONEH does wonderful work. This is not self-promotion. It's not just me. There are other classes and many chesed projects in the community. And Pirkei Avos tells us that the world stands on three pillars: Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim. Until now, YIBONEH was primarily Torah and Gemilas Chasadim. Now the second pillar is being added, so it is a wonderful opportunity to be mishtatef in Zikoi Harabim. So, Be'ezus Hashem, the project should have much bracha and hatzlacha. That also means, I guess, that this year will be moving too. So we're going to be relocating as well, so you can have a quick dinner before the shir, a nice milchik supper, and then you can come and learn. Okay, this parsha is very interesting parsha. Parsha's Toldos, because a lot of interesting things happen, and one of the difficulties, as always, is to try to be selective. Unfortunately, that's a big problem in Torah, because in Torah all of the ideas are connected, and in any given idea there's infinite depth. So like any road you choose to go down in any Dvar Torah, you'll always have the problem of the road not traveled, right? There'll always be infinite roads that thing. Now they ultimately converge, because they are all a reflection of the infinity of God's emet. But at least in Olam Hazeh, we're going down this road, so we don't have that road, etc. So I don't know why. For me, always this parsha in particular. This is true for anything in Torah, any Gemara, any parsha of the Chumash. It's true everything in Torah. But for some reason, this parsha always strikes me even more so than other parshiot. I always have this great uncertainty of what to talk about, where to focus on, because there is such a richness And also there are many ethical problems in this parsha as well, in which we try to reconcile, as it were, the morality of the Torah, which is Hashem's will, with what we feel, and obviously our feelings don't count as much as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's feelings, but still we try to reconcile it, and we run into problems in which we don't always understand what is going on. So these are very, very complicated parshiot, but I want to start off really with actually a thought from last week, because it is ultimately going to be connected. Last week we read about the shidduch of Rivka and Yitzchak Avinu. Right? Remember, Yitzchak was the only one of the patriarchs who did not make his own shidduch, and he was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael because he was sanctified as a korban. So, in a sense, he was very passive in this. And Rivka was brought to him, and it says that after they were married, Yitzchak brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and he loved her. So Rav Hirsh points out that we often assume, and maybe in most cases it is that way, that love precedes marriage, right? I marry somebody because I love them. In the case of Yitzchak Avinu, we see specifically that only after they were married and he brought her into the tent of Sarah, there was love, and Rav Hirsh points out that this is really a lesson in life, that the true love comes from building a home together, building a bias together. Meaning, any love you have before marriage is in the nature of a prediction and a hope, which could very well be wrong. But, you're hoping. It looks like this is going to work. B'ezras Hashem, it'll work. Sometimes not. That's also B'ezras Hashem, either way. But the point is, the true love comes from the striving to build a bias, and then we love each other. So that's one number. That's first point, that the Iker love comes after marriage. The second point is a very fascinating thought that Rashi communicates in the name of the Medrash. And Rashi says that in the tent of Sarah Imenu, there were 3 miracles that existed. There was a miracle that the Neros that she lit in honor of Shabbos Kodesh continued to burn the entire week, just like until they were relit before Shabbos. There was a bracha in her Esau, in the dough that she made. There was some type of characteristic that you felt full and satiated and satisfied, and that was a miracle, so to speak, that her food just kept you going. And the third was there was a cloud of glory over her tent that symbolized the Shekhinah. And when Sarah Imenu died, all of those 3 simanim left. As great as Avraham was, he could not sustain that level of kedusha without Sarah Imenu. And when little Rivka, according to Chazal, 3 years old, another opinion is 14 years old, when she came in, all of the miracles of Sarah Imenu came back. There was a bracha in the dough. The ner was daluk, me'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos. There was an anan hakavod over the oel. And that's the meaning of he brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. That in a sense, although marriage counselors will tell you a man should not marry his mother, so I don't mean it in that sense, but in the spiritual sense, that Rivka was a shalshelet. She was a link in the chain that would perpetuate the kedusha of Sarah Imenu. This is a comment that Rashi makes from the Medrash. So I want to just extend it a little bit, that some Svarim point out that the 3 miracles of the tent of Sarah actually correspond to 3 miracles that existed in the Mishkan and later in the Beit HaMikdash. The ner daluk, the candle that was lit, me'erev Shabbos le'erev Shabbos. Remember, there was a menorah in the Beit HaMikdash that was lit every day. It had 7 candles. It was lit every day. And although we always think of the Hanukkah story in which the candles burnt for 8 days, but the truth of the matter is, when we were on a madrega of holiness, there was one ner that also never went out. That was the ner tamid, 1 out of the 7. That it would be lit. The truth is, they did put it out every day, but it never burnt out by itself. It was always lit. It kept on going. Then they would have to blow it out and relight it. But Lamaisa, it never went out on its own. And therefore, the Ner Tamid corresponds to Sarah Imenu's Ner Daluk, Me'erev Shabbos Le'erev Shabbos. The bracha in the dough corresponds to the showbread, the lechem hapanim, that was baked on Friday. It was put on the gold table. The Kohanim would not eat it until next Shabbos, when it would be replaced by the bread, by new bread, and it was still warm and fresh. Warm and fresh. That's the bracha in the dough. And the cloud of glory, of course, corresponds to the fact that over the Mishkan, there was a cloud of glory, Ananei Yakavai. Now, what's the significance of that? In other words, the point is there's a correlation between the three miracles of Sarah's tent and the Beit HaMikdash. Mishkan and later the Beit HaMikdash. The lesson is that the true sanctuary of God, the true Beit HaMikdash, is the Jewish home and the relationship of husband and wife. In other words, the Beit HaMikdash is just a replication. It's an imitation. It's a model of the holiness of the tent of Avraham and Sarah. Which means a Jewish married couple has to regard their home as the Beit HaMikdash. It's not a cliche. I mean, it is a cliche, but the truth of the matter is, things that are cliches are almost always true. That's why they become cliches, because they're said a lot, because they're emes. That the most important institution in Judaism is not the shul, not the yeshiva, it is the home. That is why halachically, when a Jewish community is established, the first institution we are supposed to have is a mikveh, because a mikveh enables the relationship of husband and wife. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't mean halachically, if you're starting a new neighborhood in Baka, you got to have a new mikveh. I mean, there are existing mikvehs, but if you came to a new place in which there was nothing, the first thing you got to have is a mikveh, even before a shul. And Chazal tell us, Ish ve'isha, when there's a husband and a wife who live with shalom, Shechina sheruya beinayim, the divine presence is there. We sometimes don't understand how elevated, how holy marriage is. And you have to understand that this is independent of having children. Yeah, having children is a mitzvah and a bracha and a wonderful, wonderful thing. But the kedusha of marriage is not limited to the fact that there's children. Even in the relationship of husband and wife alone, there is sanctity, there is greatness, there is kedusha. I sometimes correspond with families that are going through the very great struggles of infertility. And indeed, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain. I mean, these are people who are righteous people, Yirei Shemayim, etc. They keep all the mitzvos. And they struggle with the loneliness of not having a child, etc., especially when the diagnosis seems to be more or less final. And of course, there are opportunities, there's adoption, there are different opportunities that exist in the world. But part of the message I try to communicate, which sometimes is accepted, sometimes emotionally not accepted, is that building the marriage itself is an act of creating a Beit HaMikdash that brings Hashem nachas and joy and makes a place in this world for the Shekhinah to exist. And we see this by the correlation between the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan, and the three miracles of Sarah Imenu. So that was one point that I wanted to bring out. Another point is, so Rivka is married to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is 40 years old. Rivka, according to Chazal, is either 3 or some say 14. There is a great discrepancy in age between Rivka and Yitzchak. Yitzchak married a much, much, much younger woman. Just as a little aside, the Netziv has a fascinating observation which is so like almost like modern psychology, lahavdil. He actually says that the Netziv contrasts the relationship of Avram and Sarah with the relationship of Yitzchak and Rivka. Sarah was very upfront. Sarah did not hold anything back. Sarah was not subtle. When they had a problem with Yishmael, Sarah just goes to Avram and says, hey, we got a problem here. We got to do something about this. And Avram was hesitant, and Hashem said, whatever Sarah says, you got to do. She is greater than you in Nevuah. When Rivka faces almost a very, very parallel situation where good son, bad influence, and Yitzchak wants to favor, the Esau, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a few moments. And so Rivka doesn't have a conversation with Yitzchak about, hey, this Esau is not as good a guy as you might think he is. Maybe you ought to reconsider. Rather, she has to create a ruse. She has to create a trick. She has to create a deception. And again, we'll discuss in a few moments some deeper levels to that. But the Netziv is just speaking as a marriage counselor here, and he's pointing out that Sarah directly confronts Avram about these family problems. Rivka needs to do it in a very indirect way. And the Netziv suggests that Rivka was in awe of Yitzchak. Rivka saw, number one, Yitzchak was much older. Number two, Yitzchak was otherworldly in a sense. Yitzchak was the Akedah. Yitzchak was the sacrifice. Of course, if you remember, last week I mentioned the great Kabbalist, the Megala Amukos, who actually says, based on a Zohar, that Yitzchak was actually killed. He was in Olam Haba for 3 years. And he came back. He's like, huh? I said last week I said 2 years, but I actually looked at Megala Amukos, it says 3 years, but okay. But either 2 or 3, whatever it would be. So came back from the dead. Imagine. So the Netziv says Rivka was in awe of him, awe of his holiness, his otherworldliness. So the Netziv points out that this can sometimes give rise to different problems, that husbands and wives have to be able to communicate, and this was an interesting example of what can happen when people do not communicate. So that's an interesting idea as well. But be it as it may, Rivka was an akara. She was unable to have children. And the pasuk says that Yitzchak and Rivka both prayed. And it says Hashem listened to the prayers of Yitzchak. So Rashi points out, it says they both were praying. Rivka was praying and Yitzchak was praying. So why does God listen to the prayers of Yitzchak more than the prayers of Rivka? So Rashi says, because Yitzchak is a tzaddik ben tzaddik. Yitzchak is a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, Abraham. Rivka is a tzaddiket. She, of course, is a righteous woman, but she comes from a Rasha, she comes from Besuel. So Eino Daima, the prayer of a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, is much greater than the prayer of a tzaddik, the son or the daughter of a Rasha, because essentially the tzaddik ben tzaddik builds on the merits of the prior generations, and that's why Hashem listens to the prayer of Yitzchak. Yeah, it's a famous Rashi, Eino Daima, Tfilas tzaddik ben tzaddik, L'tfilas tzaddik ben Rasha. So the question people ask is, well, I would think it's the opposite. Tzaddik ben tzaddik, okay, so you're righteous because your father was righteous. That's how you were raised. Everything's fine. But Rivka, to be a righteous woman when she's raised in such a perverse, corrupt, idolatrous environment, that's a greater achievement. If anything, we ought to say the prayer of a tzaddik, the son or the daughter of a Rasha, should be greater. It's a much greater spiritual achievement. So why is tzaddik ben tzaddik better? So that in the name of Rav Simcha Zisel, the altar of Kelm, the old man of Kelm, who was Rabbi Saul Salanter's probably closest Talmud, one of the greatest of the Bali Musar, says, here is the point. We know that each of the Avos served HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a different and unique way. Avram served Hashem through loving kindness. Yitzchak served Hashem through prayer and sacrifice, avoda. Right? Pirkei Avos says the 3 pillars are Torah, avoda, gemilas chasadim. Avram is chesed, and Yitzchak is avoda. And Yaakov who we'll see later, spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver without sleeping, represents Torah. Each of our avos did not simply imitate or follow their predecessor. Each of their avos served Hashem in a unique and distinct way. That's why they're avos, because each one paved a unique path. Says the Alter of Kelm, if you look at the notion of a tzaddik as not somebody who is simply imitating what was done before them, but who finds a new creative pathway to serve God, the avoda of a tzaddik ben tzaddik is actually harder. Meaning, if you're born into a family of Rishayim, as soon as you know the emes, you know you got to break away and do your own thing. Ein b'reira, there's no choice there. But if you're a tzaddik ben tzaddik, the easiest thing in the world would have been for Yitzchak just to follow Abraham. The easiest thing in the world would have been just to be a ben tzaddik. So says the Alter of Kelm, to be a tzaddik in your own right, when your father is a tzaddik, is even a greater accomplishment than to be a tzaddik in your own right, when your father is a rasha. Because tzaddik ben tzaddik, right? So that's an interesting point of not being an imitator. You know, it's interesting. I heard from my own Rosh Hashiva a very interesting story. My own Rosh Hashiva, Rav Yaakov Ruderman, who was nifter a long time ago, he was nifter in the 1980s. He was a very, very close. He and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky were cousins, and they both were very, 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 very close to the great Alter of Slobodka, who was one of the greatest. To call him a Baal Musar is almost demeaning him. I mean, he was really one of the greatest psychologists of the neshama. Just he understood what made people tick, what influenced them, what they would become. I mean, he typically would look at a kid who was 19 and say, what is he going to be in 20 years? I mean, just all of those different things. And he was always right. Anyway, the Alter of Slobodka had many, many disciples, and one of his Talmidim became one of the dominant mashgichim in Europe, pre-war. Rav Yerucham Levovitz, who was the mashgiach of Mir. Rav Yerucham was a great, phenomenal Baal Musar. And Rav Ruderman said he once heard the Alter of Slobodka going to Rav Yerucham and giving him Musar, giving Rav Yerucham tochacha for over an hour, telling Rav Yerucham was so charismatic, every Talmud tried to be like Rav Yerucham. He says, you're creating cookie cutters. You're creating imitations of yourself. That's what a Rebbe does. That's what a Baal Musar does. A Baal Musar is supposed to create clones of himself. You're supposed to mold individuals. You're supposed to be responsive. And Rav Ruderman pointed out, Rav Yerucham, who himself was the greatest mashgiach in Europe, was listening to that Musar for an hour. Rav Ruderman said, if I would speak to any of my Talmidim that way, a fraction of that way, they would walk out and leave the yeshiva like immediately. They couldn't bear it. They wouldn't stand for it. How dare I talk to them that way? And yet the great Gadol, Rav Yerucham, took that Musar from the Alter of Slobodka. Quite amazing. The truth is, the sign of a great Baal Musar is that they're happy to receive criticism and Musar, and not just give it. It says in Pirkei Avos that one of the 48 qualities of acquiring Torah is you love Musar, you love tochacha. So some people interpret that to mean, I love to give tochacha, sure. The meaning of the passage is not that you love to give Musar. It means you love to receive it. You want to grow from it. You want to take in. That's a very difficult midah. Again, I'm not suggesting it's easy for me. I have difficulties as well. But when you're makabel tochacha, that comes from a humility and a desire to grow. But coming back to this thought, the Alter of Kelm's thought, who was the Rebbe of the Alter of Slobodka himself, is the idea that you have to serve Hashem as an individual. I can talk about this for over an hour. It's not the main thing I want to talk about, but this is a big issue in the Haredi world, where there is a great emphasis for various reasons on conformity, on sameness, on kind of everybody marching in the same rhythm, to the same drummer. And of course, to some degree, Achdus does require kind of consistency and conformity and community. If everybody's moving in a different direction, you don't have a kehillah. But at the same time, we have to find some way in raising our children, in raising our talmidim, and in our own spiritual growth, how to function as individuals, in which we also have the uniqueness of our path in Torah. That is why a tzaddik ben tzaddik is even a greater accomplishment, says the Alter of Kelm, than a tzaddik ben Rasha. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning of the marriage issue. Then later it goes through different events in the life of Yitzchak. And I just want to mention very, very quickly, before I get to the main thing I want to talk about, the story of the wells. There's a whole story that Avimelech, the Philistines, had filled up the wells that Avram had dug. Remember, in those days, you didn't have indoor plumbing. I mean, you got your water from wells, and if the wells are stopped up, no water. And so Yitzchak was digging wells, reopening wells, digging new wells. And it mentions there that he had dug a well, and there was a fight over it, there was a quarrel over it, and the well was called Esek. Esek means quarreling. And then there was another well, same thing, they were fighting and contesting over it, and it was called Sitna, which is hatred. And then there was a third well that was dug, and finally they were allowed to keep that in peace, and that was called Rehovot, just like the city, Rehovot, expansiveness, because God has given us expanse, and we dwell in the land. So I just want to point out the Ramban has a very interesting mahalech throughout the book of Bereshis, and it's very worthwhile to look at literally story after story, based on the statement of Chazal, Maisa Avos Simun Labanim. Everything that happens to our patriarchs is kind of a prediction of what is going to happen in the future history of Am Yisrael. So, for example, Avraham going down to Mitzrayim and leaving with great wealth is a precursor to Yetzias Mitzrayim. And remember, Avram went because of a famine. Avram goes to Mitzrayim because of a famine, leaves with great wealth, corresponds to the Jewish people, coming down to Mitzrayim because of a famine, leaving with great wealth. This is the famous Masa Avos, Siman Labanim. So the Ramban, again, I can't say the Ramban offers an explanation in every single story, but he often emphasizes this point. And here he has a very interesting idea that each Be'er is a remez to the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash is described as a spring of water that rejuvenates, that gives life and gives purity. And we know that we had 2 Batei Mikdash that were destroyed. And the third Beit HaMikdash is going to, Be'ezus Hashem, last forever and never be destroyed. That's the Messianic Beit HaMikdash. And he says, this is Merumos. The Torah up front is Merames. There will be a double Chorban and a third temple that will never be destroyed in the Be'eros. And he says even the names are very significant. The Gemara in Yuma tells us, this is the well-known Gemara, that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of Avodah Zarah, Gili Araya, Shvichus Damim, idolatry, sexual immorality, murder, but the primary avera was idolatry. It's very, very clear that it was idolatry that gave them license to do everything else. If you look in the Nevi'im, you see Avodah Zarah is the worst of the averos. Avodah Zarah is called Esek. You're quarreling with God. You're quarreling. You're fighting against God. You're trying to replace God. So the first well is a remez to the Bayis Rishon that was destroyed because of the quarreling with God, which is Avodah Zarah. The second Beit HaMikdash, destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, Chazal say that most of the Jewish people were keeping the mitzvot, but it was destroyed because of sinat chinam, hatred, polarization, machlokas. What's the name of the second well? Sitna, the well of hatred. That's Merames to the second Beit HaMikdash. The third Beit HaMikdash, which will never be destroyed, Rechovot. God has given me expansiveness. Just as David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Min HaMeitzer Karasika. I call out to God from the narrow, confining straits. Anani B'merchav. Hashem will answer me with expansiveness. And that's Rechovot. Rechovot is Keneged, the Geula. So this is a very beautiful example of Maisa Avay Siman Labanim. I would just add, although I don't think the Ramban says it, that if you look in the book of Yechezkel, the end of Yechezkel, that describes the third Beis HaMikdash, the Messianic Beis HaMikdash. He describes a great fountain emerging from the Kodesh HaKodashim. It's one of the visions, that water of life will come. And it'll start off as a very narrow trickle, that leaving the Kodesh HaKodashim will be a trickle of water. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and turn into a river going through Yerushalayim. And in that river, on the banks of the river, there will be trees with fruits that will have medicinal properties, healing the illnesses. And it talks about how the river gets bigger and bigger and bigger till it flows, part of it flows into the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea becomes revived, becomes fresh, and then into the Mediterranean, even converting that into fresh water. So the notion that we compare the Beis HaMikdash to a be'er is actually emerges from Tanakh itself, where we see that from the Kodesh HaKodashim will come out the purifying waters of the be'er Mayim Chayim, right? So this is a beautiful example of Maisa of a Siman Labanim. Okay, so now we go to the main act, the main thing I wanted to talk about, and that is the story of the brachos of Yaakov and Esau, the story of Yitzchak. Let me point out that the beginning of Parshas Toldos, when Yaakov seemingly takes advantage of Esau's hunger and buys the birthright, that actually occurred when the boys were only 15 years old. That was the day that Avram Avinu died. And that is why Yaakov is cooking lentils to feed to his father Yitzchak, because lentils are the food that, just like, today hard-boiled eggs, but something oval is what you feed a mourner, based on the idea that the cycle of life changes, Gamzu Latova, Gamze Yavor, this true will pass, and the like. So that happened when they were 15. They're twins, they're the same age. That was 15. The story of the brachos, and Rashi gives you an intricate cheshbon, happens when they are 63 years old. You don't get this impression necessarily, but if you do the math, and there's a very, very long Rashi at the end of Chayisara that does the math for you, based on the Gemara and Megillah, it is important to know that Yaakov and Esau are not children anymore. They're 63 years old. And that means since Yitzchak was 40, Yitzchak was 60 when Yaakov and Esau were born. So Yitzchak is only 123 years old. Now Yitzchak says, I don't know when I'm going to die. Now the truth of the matter, Yitzchak is going to live for many, many more years. But he doesn't know. He doesn't know. So he says, he calls his son Esau, and he asks Esau to get him some hunting meat, etc. Chazal say Esau was such a good hunter that Esau could actually shecht prey. He could actually shoot an arrow, and it would sever exactly the place where you shecht. Right? So if somebody is a real good archer, they could do shechita by shooting an arrow and the like. And he wanted to give brachos to Esau. He wanted to give a special bracha to Esau. And Rivka sees that's not good. So she has, essentially, just to go over the story very quickly for a moment, she has Yaakov impersonate Esau. And Yaakov gets the brachos that Yitzchak intended for Esau to get. And then Esau shows up, and Yitzchak says, sorry, too late. Who are you? I gave the brachos to whoever I gave it, and apparently that is God's will, and I have to accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will, as this is the way it is. He gives Esau a secondary bracha, and this is said to be the source of the enmity and the hatred that Esau has for Yaakov, because Yaakov stole the brachos. There are so many questions on all of this that it's difficult to even know where to start. But let's just start with a very, very simple question. Why would Yitzchak want to give special brachos to Esau? What's going on? Does Yitzchak not know that Yaakov is the righteous one and Esau is not so righteous? Does Yitzchak want to give the bracha to the son that's not righteous? So there are essentially three basic approaches on this fundamental question. Approach number one is Yitzchak was fooled. Yitzchak thought Esau was a much more righteous person than he was. Number one, when it says in the beginning of the Parsha, Tzayid b'piv, hunting was in his mouth, Rashi interprets that he could trap people with his words. Esau especially showed great honor to his father Yitzchak. Also, it is said that Yitzchak was so holy. Yitzchak was otherworldly. He could not perceive hypocrisy. He could not perceive duplicity. If somebody came across as a righteous person, Yitzchak simply saw it as it was presented to him and was not familiar. Only Rivka, who came from a house of cheating and deception and lying, as well as a mother's intuition generally, was able to see through pretenses. Yitzchak could not. So that's view number one. I'm just mentioning the views that basically say Yitzchak was fooled. Yitzchak was tricked. Yitzchak believed that Esau was a righteous person. Problem with that is, the problem with that is that we see very, very clearly that Yitzchak knew who Esau was. We see it in a few places. Number one, when Yaakov comes with the goat skins, and and the famous words, the voice is the voice of Yaakov. Yitzchak said, you sound like Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Right? Famous, famous words. So Rashi explains, the voice is the voice of Yaakov doesn't mean Yaakov had a different voice. Yaakov and Esau had twins. Their voices were exactly the same. But it means the manner of speaking was Yaakov's manner of speaking, because he mentions Hashem. Esau never mentions Hashem. So Yitzchak knows Esau doesn't mention Hashem. So he knows Esau is not the tzaddik in the family. That's one thing. The other thing is, right before this story, it mentions Esau married Canaanite wives, which was something that was very despicable to the Avos. And the Torah says it was a source of bitterness to Yitzchak, and Rivka. So those are two indicators that in point of fact, Yitzchak understood Esau was not super righteous. Right? So that would be a question on Pshat number one. Pshat number two is Yitzchak understands that Esau is not so righteous, but he wants to give the bracha to Esau anyway for the following consideration. A bracha is ultimately a crutch. I'm giving my child a bracha that God should give him certain abilities, certain kochos. Now remember that Avram represents the attribute of kindness. Yitzchak, I mentioned before, Avram is chesed, Yitzchak is avoda, and Yaakov is Torah. That corresponds to Torah, avoda, gemilas, chasadim. But Kabbalistically, it's represented in slightly a different way in terms of the divine energies. Avram is the midah of chesed. Yitzchak is called gevura, inner strength, or din. And Yaakov is said to be the mizug, the synthesis of chesed and gevura that is called tiferet, beauty. So Yitzchak represents midas hadin. Now, optimally, Yitzchak does not want to give a crutch to the person who is capable of achieving avodah on his own. He says, I don't want, it's like for example, you could imagine a situation where you have a multimillionaire. I'll give you a Gashmias example. Multimillionaire. And he has two children. One son is a successful businessman in his own right, who has already made millions and millions of dollars. The other is a nebuchal. He's not too successful. He just can't figure out what to do. Well, a father might logically say, hey, the son that can take care of himself, why should I give a crutch to? Let him become the person that he is. The one that can't do it on his own, I'll give him the crutch. So some want to suggest that because Yitzchak's personality is midas hadin, he doesn't want to give Yaakov the bracha, he does not want to give Yaakov the artificial crutch of a siyua. He wants it to go to Esau, hoping that that will bring Esau over in Avodas Hashem on some level. Meaning it's the midas hadin that says, I want Yaakov to earn it. In fact, the Mefarshim say that is sometimes why Hashem makes life harder for tzaddikim. Because tzaddikim are so great that they will serve God even when there's obstacles. So God says, I'll give them the obstacles. And that way they will grow even greater in their avodas Hashem. In a sense, he wanted Yaakov to have a harder life because he knew that Yaakov would achieve greater spiritual heights. And this is consistent with Midas Hadin. Now, this actually leads to a very interesting conclusion. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky makes the following observation. He says, we find in all the lives of all of the avos that they go through what is called a nisayon, a challenge, a test. And as Ramban points out, this is not a test. Even the Akedah that's called a test is not that God needs to know what Avram is going to do. Hashem knows that. But the purpose of a nisayon is for the person himself to bring out the qualities. In other words, to bring out the quality of devotion within Avram, to be motzi from the koach, from the potential, to the actualization. But you find that the idea of nisayon is always going the opposite of your natural inclination. Right? We have natural inclinations, we have tendencies, we have midos, we have propensities. The idea of nisayon is to think outside the box, to go outside the box, to go to a place that is not your natural comfort zone. Because when you serve Hashem based on what is familiar to you, are you serving Hashem or are you simply going on automatic pilot? But if you serve Hashem going against your nature, that shows you're truly devoted. Thus, Avram Avinu, whose primary modality was always the midah of chesed and kindness, all of his nisyonos are forcing him in the direction of cruelty, leaving his aged father to come to Eretz Yisrael, sending away Yishmael, which he had difficulty doing, being commanded to sacrifice his beloved son Yitzchak. Avram Avinu has to show that yes, I serve Hashem primarily by chesed. But if God calls upon me to behave in a cruel way, I will behave with cruelty. With Yaakov, we find a similar idea, that Yaakov is identified in Nach as the exemplar of emes. We say, Titein emes liYaakov. Ascribe truth to Yaakov. Yaakov is emes. So what does Yaakov find himself doing? He has to engage in deception and sheker to get the brachas. And we'll find later with Lavan that, although it's not sheker per se, but Yaakov has to engage in various types of tricks. And of course, buying the bechorah from Esau. In other words, a person has to know. Okay, this can be abused, and you have to be very careful with this idea. A person has to know that sometimes I have to be willing to serve Hashem in ways that go beyond my nature. That's the idea of nisayon. So the big question is, what nisayon did Yitzchak have? Where do you find this similar idea with Yitzchak? So some want to suggest the fact that his inclination of din would be to only give the brachas to Esau and not to Yaakov, because Yaakov should do it on his own. And yet, when Hashem made it happen, that Yaakov got the brachas, Yitzchak's nisayon was to accept that as the will of God and say, Gam Baruch Yiyah, I recognize that Yaakov gets the brachas. What is Yitzchak doing? Yitzchak is forced to use the midah of rachamim and understand that even Yaakov, and maybe especially Yaakov, needs this bracha to be able to accomplish his mission in the world. That gufa is the nisayon of Yitzchak, and that is accepting that the brachos belong to Yaakov, even though the midas hadin of Yitzchak would be inclined to not give the brachos, to Yaakov. In fact, we see this interesting push and pull in the brachos itself. There are two interesting linguistic features in the bracha. The first observation about this is found in the Baal HaTurim. The Baal HaTurim points out that Yitzchak's bracha is with midas hadin. Vayitein l'cha Elokim mital hashamayim. God shall give you from the dew of the heavens. Now, Elokim, we know, is always the attribute of justice, judgment. Meaning, even when he's giving the crutch to Esau, he says, midas hadin. Meaning, if you have to try to deserve it, you have to try to earn it. If you don't earn it, you're not going to get it. So even if he's giving the bracha to Esau, it's like midas hadin. And yet the Baal HaTurim says, midas harachamim is hidden in the midas hadin, because the bracha vayitein l'cha Elokim is 26 words. If you count it, 26 words. 26 is the gematria of the Shem Havaya, Yud Ke, Yud He, Vav He, meaning in the bracha of Elokim, Yitzchak understands there has to be rachamim as well. Another interesting point. Remember, this is when Yitzchak thinks he's blessing Esau, but Lamaisa, all of this is going to Yaakov. And that is, do you remember, this is actually a very beautiful story, in Nachal Kidron, in the little valley between the old city and the Mount of Olives, Har Hazeisim, right? You have the Kidron Valley. So there's a little monument there that is said to be Yad Avshalom, the monument of Avshalom. Avshalom was the son of David, who tried to kill his father. Now, Lamaisa, whether that is Yad Avshalom or not is a bit of a question. Some of those identifications are frankly from the Crusaders. They're not even of Jewish origin, but whatever it is, some people consider that to be the monument of Shalom made to himself. And it's not a Makom Tefillah. People go to the Kotel, people go to all sorts of places. You don't normally daven by Yad Avshalom. But they say Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to daven by Yad Avshalom. He considered that to be a Makom Tefillah. Why is that? Because he said, remember that when David's general, Yoav, killed, or ordered that Avshalom be killed, remember Avshalom got trapped in his hair, he was hanging from a tree, and he was killed, he was stabbed. And Yoav thought David would be happy with the good news because Avshalom wanted to kill David, he wanted to kill his father. And David was broken, David was crushed. And he said, Avshalom b'ni, 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 if only I could have died instead of you. Avshalom b'ni. So Chazal say the following. Avshalom said the word b'ni, my son, 8 times. 7 times, because there are 7 depths of Gehenna, whatever that means. Each time, he brought his neshama 1 level out of a Gehenna, and the 8th time, he brought him to Olam Haba. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz saw this as so moving and powerful about the love of a father for a child, no matter how wayward the child. And he said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, can't you look at us as David looked at his son Avshalom? Avshalom b'ni, 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 b'ni. So here is a fascinating point. Yitzchak Avinu, when he thinks he's talking to Esau, actually refers to him as b'ni 8 times. And the Sifrei Chasidus apply the Chazal of Avshalom. He knows Esau is a Rasha, but he wants to bring him up from the levels of Gehenna and be machnasim to Olam Haba. 8 times, just as David HaMelech. Now, Lamaisa, it turned out that he's not doing this to Esau. He's doing this to Yaakov. But through that bracha, no Jew is lost. Meaning, no matter how far a person is, that bracha is going to bring you up. In fact, that's even the significance of the fact that in addition to the goat skins, Yaakov is also wearing the special garments of Esau. The precious garments of Esau that Esau got from Nimrod. And Nimrod got from Adam HaRishon. Exactly, the exact chain is not so clear, but we do know Adam, Nimrod, Esau, because Esau killed Noah. We know that according to different midrashim, Esau actually killed the great hunter, the great ruler, Nimrod. And those garments were the kosnos or, the garments that Adam HaRishon, Hashem gave to Adam HaRishon after the Chet. But the point is that even when a Yaakov dresses like an Esau, that's bechitzonius, that's external. Yeah, he looks like an Esau, but he's not an Esau, meaning that's the yesod of how the person goes from Gehenna. And that's why Chazal have a drasha. Vayarach es reach begadav. Yitzchak smelled the aroma of the garments, and he said, this is the field that God, this is the reach of the field that Hashem has blessed. But Chazal have a double entendre. The word bigadav could be, without nekudot, could be read bogdav. Yitzchak saw into the future, and he saw rebellious people. He saw Rishayim. But he said, even those Rishayim are ultimately holy. And the Gemara gives an example of a person from the time of the Second Temple, Yosef Meshisa. Yosef Meshisa was a Rasha. He was a Rasha. When the Romans destroyed the temple, he collaborated with the Romans. He helped them in their nefarious work. And they offered him compensation. They said, hey, you go into the temple, take whatever you want. Take a gold, whatever it is, take some piece of gold. It belongs to you. So he goes in. He takes out the menorah. Little too much. The Romans wanted the menorah. They said, no, that you don't get. Go and get something a little less expensive. So at that point he said, I'm not going. I went once. I'm not going to do this again. And they ordered him to go. And they killed him. He died, al Kiddush Hashem. Because he did tshuva in his last moments. They tell a very similar story in the Holocaust. I mean, it's probably more than one story. I just remember reading about a barber who was a Mechalel Shabbos, and he was an Apikoros, and he really was very against anything to do with Torah. And when the Nazis desecrated a shul and they took a Sefer Torah and they put it on the ground, Rachmana litzlan, they ordered him to stomp on the Torah. And he didn't care. He would have said, a year before, that I spit on the Torah. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. He said, I may have been a bad Jew. I'm not going to stomp on the Torah. And he was tortured. And he died. So Yitzchak said B'ni 8 times. Because he smelled that even the rebellious are ultimately good. They're wearing the garments of Esau. But they're not Esau. But the only problem is, Yitzchak thinks it's Esau. He thinks all of this is about Esau. So, B'kitzer, I was marich in this, but B'kitzer, approach number 1 is Yitzchak was fooled and he thought Esau was righteous. I mentioned that's a difficult approach. Approach number 2 is he wanted to give Esau a bracha because Yaakov didn't need the crutch, and Midas Hadin would give the bracha to the less righteous person, and the Midas Hadin would not give the bracha to the more righteous person because the more righteous person should make it on his own. But Yitzchak's nisayon was to be makir that even Yaakov needed rachamim. And in Yitzchak's own bracha, he gives the bracha b'midas hadin, but the 26 words is a hidden rachamim. And the idea of b'ni 8 times is just like Avshalom, to be Maila Esau, he thinks, to Olam Haba, out of Gehenim, and take him to Olam Haba. There is a third approach to this story, which is the approach of the Malbim. That's actually very, very interesting. He points out that Yaakov actually gets 2 different brachos. Yaakov gets a bracha when Yitzchak thinks he's Esau. But then, when Yaakov leaves to go to Haran and find a wife, Yitzchak gives him a bracha, knowing that he's blessing Yaakov. So, Yaakov gets the bracha intended for Esau, and then Yaakov gets a specific bracha. Says the Malbim, the specific bracha that Yitzchak gave Yaakov, knowing he's Yaakov, was always going to go to Yaakov. And that's the bracha that you will be the successor of Abraham. You will be the one that has the mission of holiness into the world. But the Malbim says the following idea. All of us know in later history, we developed the 2 tribes of Yisachar and Zevulun. And as is well known, Yisachar is the tribe that is primarily Osek B'Torah. And Zevulun is the tribe that was involved in commerce and business. And Zevulun used its resources to help Yisachar. And therefore, Zevulun gets equal credit with Yisachar in the Torah. There's even today we talk about a Yisachar Zevulun partnership, in which I'll take a person who's learning and I'll pay for him, and etc. And right, that's the idea of right. So here is what Yitzchak thought. Yitzchak knows that Yaakov is the learner, Yaakov is the tzaddik, Yaakov is the Talmid Chacham. But Yitzchak loves Esau. Yitzchak sees the good in Esau. Yitzchak sees that even though Esau is not going to be the one that's going to sit in the Beis HaMedrash, but Esau has energy, Esau has ambition, Esau has initiative. What can I do for Esau that will enable him to have a meaningful life? The answer is, I will give him the brachos of Eilam Hazeh, of Eretz Yisrael. And he'll build the army, he'll build the society, he'll drain the ditches, he'll plant the fields. And that's going to be a wonderful thing for Yaakov and for Esau. It'll give Yaakov the time to contemplate, to think, to pray, to learn, not to be worried about the gashmias of the world. And Esau, who's not capable of sitting and learning, but he will use his kochos to create a society where the Yaakovs can flourish. So Yitzchak envisioned a Zevulun Yisachar partnership. That is why when Yitzchak thinks he's talking to Esau, the bracha is about Olam Hazeh. But the bracha he gives to Yaakov is about the spiritual legacy of Abraham. That's always Yaakov's. So Yitzchak's cheshbon is, there's no naivete here, at least in a gross way. He knows Esau is not the tzaddik. But he loves Esau. And he wants Esau to have some way of connecting to God through his talents and through his abilities. And that's why he told him, you're a hunter. Okay, did Yitzchak love hunters? Probably not. But Yitzchak says, use your hunting to bring me kibbud avim. Do a mitzvah, yeah, you can still be Esau. I'm not trying to take you away from your sports. But can't you use it in a good way? And this was his whole cheshbon. Now, the truth of the matter is, this might have worked at an earlier time. There's a comment from Rav Hirsh, and whenever I say it, I get in trouble, so I need to say, it is from Rav Hirsh, it is not from me, in which, at the very beginning in Parshas Toldos, when it says, Vayigdalu hana'arim, the young boys grew up, and it says, Esau became a hunter, and Yaakov became Yoshev Oel, a dweller of the tents, learning Torah and the like. Rav Hirsh says, this was the problem. Vayigdalu hana'arim means they were raised the same way. You know, people like to raise twins the same way. They were both put in the Beis Medrash, whatever that meant exactly. Both of them got to learn 12 hours. Problem is, that wasn't Esau's nature. Esau needed to play basketball. Esau needed to be out there. Esau needed to do his things. Now, had, Rav Hirsh writes, people are critical. How dare we criticize the Avos? So, but even if, we're not talking about the Avos, this is something for children generally. If you try to make an Esau into a Yaakov, not only are you not going to get a Yaakov, you're not going to get the Esau who could have been an Esau. Esau had kochot that could have been good. In fact, in many ways, Esau and David HaMelech share a similarity. According to the Zohar, they're both described as Admoni, red, energy, initiative, forcefulness. These are positive qualities. There's a whole theory out there, Rabbi Kesson talks about it, that Trump, the red Trump, is kind of a manifestation of the good side of Esau, along with the bad stuff. But there's kind of a positivity there of accomplishing things. So Rav Hirsh said, had there been more attention paid to the individuality of Esau, Esau might have accomplished. So now it's kind of too little too late. Many years later, at the age of when the kids are 63, Yitzchak is now trying to rectify Vayigdalu hana'arim. Okay, Esau, I don't expect you to sit in the Beis Medrash. Go ahead, make your army, do all your stuff, but use it to help Yaakov. But too little too late. Esau, it's a tragedy. Esau is already what Esau is. And that's what Rivka was able to see. So this is the inside of the Malbim, very, very beautiful Malbim, combining it with Rav Hirsh, that in a sense, this is Yitzchak's attempt to do what is good for both Yaakov and Esau, to recognize the individuality of Esau. And again, I have to say that this is a very, very important klal in chinuch, in raising our children. Chanoch l'nar al pi darko. Shlema Melech says, train a child according to their personality. You try to make somebody into someone else. You're not going to be successful in that, but what's worse is all of the good that person could have become is not going to happen. You've destroyed them. In other words, he's not going to become what you want him to be, and he's not going to become what he could have become. And that's the tragedy of Esau. There are tragic dimensions in this, and that's why Chazal say, Liyasid Lavo, there'll be tikkunim, Liyasid Lavo, Yishmael will do tshuva, Liyasid Lavo, Esau will be tshuva. There is good and bad, in Esau and in Yishmael, and these different forces will come out at different times. But at least in the short term, which is most of our history, thousands of years history, we're faced with all of this. Right? So these are kind of three perspectives on the bracha. Again, just to summarize, Yitzchak was fooled, which is, I think, very difficult. Number two, Yitzchak didn't want to give Yaakov the bracha because of Midas Hadin. He wanted Yaakov to earn it. Number three, Yitzchak was always going to give the Birkas Avraham to Yaakov, but he wanted a division of labor so that Yaakov would be panoi to learn Torah, and the Gashmias of the world would be given to Esau. Now, I just want to point out, in some ways, just make the point very, very quickly. So you read the Parsha, and Yaakov gets the bracha from Esau. He takes it. The question really becomes, well, did Yaakov really get a bracha? I mean, after all, Jews have been persecuted, Jews have suffered, meaning the Medrash actually says that Yaakov took the brachos that Yitzchak gave him, and Yaakov stored it up for the Yemot HaMashiach. Meaning, in Olam Hazeh, in this world, we haven't gotten the brachos. We haven't gotten the brachos. So, in a sense, Esau won. Meaning, in spite of Yaakov's theft, Esau has much hatzlacha in the world, right? Because Yaakov kept those brachos for the Geula Hasida. Geula Hasida, well, we hope we're, near that beautiful, pivotal event. And may all of Klal Yisrael, be lizecher to that Geula Shlema, b'mehera v'yameinu. Just thank you.